The night the storm hit, the entire valley went dark. Power lines snapped like twigs. Roofs groaned under the weight of the snow. Doors froze shut. And as the temperature dropped below zero, the people who once laughed the loudest were the first to panic. But one home stayed warm. One home stayed bright. And it wasn't even above the ground. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because this story might just change the way you think about survival. The Valley of Pine Ridge was known for its brutal winters. Every year, the snow came early and stayed late. But this year was different. The radio had been warning about it for days. Meteorologists called it a once-in-a-generation storm. Some said it could bury entire houses. Most people stocked up on canned food, batteries, and firewood. They sealed their windows and checked their generators. But one man was doing something that made the whole town whisper. His name was Daniel Carter. Instead of reinforcing his wooden cabin like everyone else, Daniel was digging into the hillside behind his property. Day after day, even as the temperature dropped, he shoveled dirt and hauled rocks. He worked alone, with only a small lantern glowing beside him. People slowed their trucks as they passed his land. Some rolled down their windows just to stare. "What's he building, a grave?" one man joked. Another laughed. "Looks like he's planning to live like a mole." At the local diner, the jokes became a daily routine. Daniel would walk in, order black coffee, and sit quietly at the counter. And every time someone had something to say, "Hey Daniel, how's the hole coming along? You gonna invite us underground when the snow comes? Or are you just hiding from the rest of us?" Daniel never argued. He never explained. He just smiled, finished his coffee, and left. But the truth was, he wasn't digging a hole. He was building a home. Inside the hillside, hidden behind thick layers of earth, he carved out a small but sturdy space. The walls were reinforced with timber. The roof was supported by heavy beams, and the entrance was protected by a thick insulated door. It wasn't fancy. There were no large windows or shiny floors. Just a simple stove, a few beds, shelves of food, and thick blankets. But it had one powerful secret: the earth around it. Daniel knew something most of the town ignored. Underground, the temperature stayed steady. Even in the harshest winters, the soil held warmth. While the air above could freeze pipes and crack walls, the ground below stayed calm and stable. He had learned it years ago while working on construction sites in the north. Old miners used underground shelters to survive the cold. Farmers stored crops in root cellars for the same reason. So when he heard about the coming storm, he didn't trust wood and nails alone. He trusted the earth. Still, the laughter never stopped. One afternoon, as he carried a stack of supplies into the hillside, his neighbor Mark walked over, shaking his head. "You really think that hole's gonna save you?" Mark asked. Daniel wiped the dirt from his hands. "It's not a hole. It's a shelter." Mark chuckled. "My cabin's got a new generator, double insulation, and enough firewood for 2 winters. I'll take that over living like a rabbit." Daniel only smiled. "I hope you never have to find out." Mark laughed as he walked away. "Yeah, me too." But 3 days later, the sky turned gray. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a warning. Snow started falling in thick, heavy flakes. By evening, the roads were already disappearing under white drifts. The storm had arrived earlier than expected, and it was stronger than anyone imagined. By midnight, the power went out across the entire valley. The temperature dropped fast. Inside their cabins, people huddled near fireplaces and heaters, hoping the storm would pass quickly. But outside, the wind only grew louder. Roofs creaked, windows rattled, and somewhere in the darkness, a loud crack echoed across the frozen hills. It was the sound of the first power pole snapping in half. Inside his underground shelter, Daniel quietly closed the heavy door. The soft glow of the stove filled the room with warm light. The air was still, calm, almost silent. Above him, the storm raged like a wild animal, and it was only getting started. By morning, the storm had swallowed the valley. Snowdrifts reached the windows of most cabins. Some doors wouldn't open at all. The roads were gone, buried under thick white layers that kept rising with every passing hour. The wind howled without pause, pushing the snow sideways like waves in a frozen ocean. Inside his wooden cabin, Mark pulled his coat tighter around his chest. The power had gone out during the night, just like the rest of the valley. His generator had worked for a few hours, but the fuel line had frozen. Now the heater was silent, and the cold was creeping in from every direction. His breath came out in pale clouds. He stomped his boots on the floor, trying to keep the blood moving. The fireplace still burned, but the wood was disappearing fast. He had planned for a normal storm, maybe 2 or 3 days of cold. Not this. Not a storm that felt endless. Across the valley, other families were facing the same fear. Some tried to dig their doors open, only to find the snow too heavy. Others huddled under blankets, waiting for the temperature to rise. But it didn't. Every hour it dropped lower. Inside Daniel's underground shelter, the air felt completely different. Warmth filled the small space. The stove glowed softly, but it didn't need to work very hard. The earth around the shelter held a natural heat, protecting the room from the freezing wind above. Daniel checked the thermometer on the wall. It hadn't moved all night. He poured hot water into a metal cup and sat quietly at the small wooden table. The storm outside sounded like a distant roar, muffled by layers of soil and rock. It felt safe, still, almost peaceful. But he couldn't stop thinking about the people above him. He remembered the laughter at the diner, the jokes, the smiles. None of them had believed the storm would be this bad. And now it was only the first day. By the second night, the situation grew worse. Mark's firewood was nearly gone. He wrapped himself in 3 blankets and sat close to the dying flames. His fingers felt stiff. His toes burned with cold. He looked at the door, now completely buried behind snow. Then he thought about the hillside behind Daniel's house, about the hole they all laughed at. For a long moment he just sat there, staring at the weak fire. Pride kept him in his chair, but the cold didn't care about pride. Finally, he stood up. He pulled on his thickest coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and pushed against the door. Barely moved. Snow pressed against it from the outside like a frozen wall. He shoved harder. With a heavy crunch, the door opened just enough for him to squeeze through. A blast of icy wind hit his face like knives. Snow covered everything. The world looked silent, empty, and white. He stepped forward, each movement slow and heavy. The wind nearly knocked him down. But he kept walking, heading toward the hillside, toward the place he once laughed at. Back inside the underground shelter, Daniel was stacking more wood near the stove when he heard something. A faint sound. Not the wind. Not the creak of the earth. A knock. Soft, weak, almost lost in the storm. He froze, listening carefully. There it was again. Knock, knock. Daniel moved quickly to the entrance. He unlocked the heavy door and pulled it open just a little. A gust of snow rushed inside. And in the doorway stood Mark, covered in ice, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mark's voice came out in a shaky whisper. "Daniel? Can I come in?" Daniel stepped aside without a word. As the door closed behind them, the warm air wrapped around Mark like a blanket. His shoulders dropped. His frozen hands slowly opened. And for the first time since the storm began, he felt something he hadn't felt in 2 days. Hope. But the storm outside wasn't finished. And soon more people would come knocking. By the 3rd day, the storm reached its peak. Snow had buried cars, fences, and entire porches. The valley looked like a frozen ocean, waves of white stretching as far as the eye could see. Some cabins were nearly invisible, their roofs the only parts still showing above the drifts. Inside the underground shelter, the air remained calm and warm. The small stove glowed steadily, and the thick earth around the walls held the heat like a giant blanket. Mark sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a cup of hot soup. Color had finally returned to his face. He looked around the shelter, still amazed. "It's warmer down here than my cabin ever was," he said quietly. Daniel gave a small smile. The ground doesn't fight the cold. It ignores it. Mark shook his head. We all laughed at you. Thought you were crazy. Daniel shrugged. Sometimes crazy just means different. Just then, another knock echoed at the door. Then another. Daniel opened it to find a young couple standing outside, their coats covered in snow, a small child in their arms. The baby's face was red from the cold. Please, the woman said. Our heater died. We don't know where else to go. Daniel stepped aside immediately. Come in. As the door closed, the warm air wrapped around them. The woman's eyes filled with tears of relief. The child stopped crying almost instantly, comforted by the heat. Within hours, more people came. A retired man whose pipes had frozen. A teenager sent by his parents after their roof started leaking snow. Even the old diner owner, still wearing his apron under his coat. Each knock told the same story. Cold, fear, no power, no heat. And each time, Daniel opened the door without hesitation. By evening, the small underground shelter was full. People sat close together, sharing blankets, hot drinks, and quiet conversations. The glow of the stove lit their faces with soft orange light. Above them, the storm still roared. But down below, it felt like another world. Safe, warm, alive. The next morning, the wind finally slowed. The snowfall softened into gentle flakes. And for the first time in days, a pale beam of sunlight touched the valley. When Daniel opened the door, the sight outside was shocking. Snowdrifts as high as rooftops, collapsed sheds, frozen pipes, entire cabins without smoke rising from their chimneys. But behind him, inside the earth, every single person in the shelter was safe. Word spread quickly once the roads were cleared. Rescue teams arrived. Power lines were repaired. Life slowly returned to normal. But the laughter never came back. Instead, people gathered around Daniel's hillside, studying the entrance to the underground shelter. The same men who once joked at the diner now asked serious questions. How deep did you dig? What kind of insulation did you use? Do you think you could help me build one too? Daniel didn't brag. He didn't say, I told you so. He just nodded and shared what he knew. By the next winter, the valley looked different. Several homes had underground storage rooms. Some had small earth-sheltered spaces behind their cabins. Others built reinforced root cellars for emergencies. The storm had changed more than the landscape. It had changed minds. And at the diner, where the jokes once filled the air, a new saying started to spread. Don't laugh at the man digging into the hill. He might be the only warm one when winter comes. If this story surprised you, make sure to subscribe for more powerful survival stories. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because you never know who might be listening from the middle of their own storm.